Hi, my name's Gabe Rector, and today I'm going to be reading Ronan Boyle and the Bridge of Riddles by Thomas Lennon. It's a pretty good book about a little Irish boy who goes through some rough times, and he deals with some fantasy creatures, mostly leprechauns, throughout his travels. Chapter 1: The Narrowest Fellow. The 6th of December. It almost never snows in Ireland. Ireland is a temperate zone. Snow-wise, the best you can hope for is a dusting. If most Irish snows were Parmesan cheese on your spaghetti, you would gesture to the waiter and say, "More, per favor." That isn't nearly enough. But Tuesday, the 6th of December, was a bona fide blizzard. When my phone buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, I was in a profound coma. The night before had been the retirement party of Captain John Fernley. Fernley is a lovely man who had been like a father figure to me since the scandal. 2 years ago, I was sitting on a metal file cabinet in his office, as there are no extra chairs. Fernley prefers that no one talk to him for a length of time that would necessitate them sitting down, but he made an exception for me on my first day. "Gonna make a basket awesome?" he said, handing me half his tuna sandwich, his eyes filled with kindness. He may have, in fact, have said, "Gonna make the best of it, aren't you, son?" But I couldn't be sure. Fernley has the kind of country accent that's almost impossible to understand, even for Irish people. I took the sandwich and had a bite. I'd never eaten a tuna sandwich before, and the smell was intriguing. "Thank you, sir," I said as my face went flush and tears welled up in my eyes. "Sour and lettuce, tall stout," he mumbled, tasseling my hair and very likely saying, "It's all right, son. Let it all out." But I wasn't crying, despite my sorry state. Tuna had just been added to the list of things to which I'm very allergic. If you have food allergies like me, you'll know the best thing to do in this circumstance is to make yourself throw up, which I did. There was a brief pause. Fernley didn't make a fuss, and he didn't judge. The kindness never left his eyes. Idris Elba, said Fernley, handing me his handkerchief. I'm fairly certain that this was actually clean yourself up. Then he gave me €2 for the Phantom machine because he's the type of everyday hero who does things like this. Now, 2 years later, it was 4:30 in the morning, and my mobile phone was ing. The view out the window of my shared flat looks directly into Galway Bay. The sun wouldn't be up for almost 4 more hours. Between the waves crashing on the seawall and the snow driving sideways, Galway did not look like a planet I would want to visit without a spacesuit. I had been asleep for approximately 3 hours. I looked to the mirror, expecting to present a sad state, but was pleasantly surprised to see I looked so very handsome. This was because I was not yet wearing my glasses. I put them on and saw that I was still, in fact, regular Ronan Boyle, the nearsighted, gangly person that I was the night before. But somehow even worse, as I had only slept for approximately 3 hours. The voice on the opposite end of my phone kicked me out of my slumber. It was a mysterious Garda, the Irish word for police, officer named Pat Finch, whose ghoulish face is so crisscrossed with bright red veins that it looks like a map of hell drawn by a monk in a medieval lunatic asylum. Pat Finch looks like what a heart attack would look like if it could walk around eating fish and chips and saying terrible things about Roscommon Football Club's starting lineup. But underneath all of that on the outside, Pat Finch is really just a nasty person. Pat Finch was not someone you wanted on the other end of your phone at any time of day. But here he was. Or rather, in my brain it seemed, because he was yelling so very loudly. Is this Boyle with the Galway Garda?" he bellowed. I replied. "But, there are 2 Boyles in the Galway office, sir. I suspect you must want the other one, Connor. He's the ranking sergeant." I'm the younger one, Ronan, intern in the evidence department. Are you that little skinny one? He asked. I wasn't sure how to respond to this. By all accounts, I am fairly thin, not from a strict regime, but as a byproduct of many severe allergies and being a terrible cook. Yes, I suppose, I said. Then get your skinny behind out here to Clifton, you idiot! And with a wet snort that sounded like a boar with a mouthful of macaroni, he hung up. Clifton, I thought to myself, as I was the only person there to think anything. Dolores, my flatmate, was nowhere to be seen. Dolores is my legal guardian and has been ever since the scandal 2 years ago. She is a professional busker in Galway and one of the most beautiful fiddle players you'll ever meet. She is also very popular, which means I'm almost always on my own, without a legal guardian. This is fine by me, as Dolores is an absolute delight, but not great with domestic things and positively terrible with kids. There was a bit of trouble getting myself immediately to Clifton because I can't drive. I have no car, and I did not know what Clifton was. It's not a town as I had thought. Clifton is a castle out on the coast in Connemara. It was almost 2 hours before I got there via the 923 coach, which is a bus. By then, the blizzard had dissipated into rain, as Ireland is a temperate zone and it hardly ever snows. Later, I would mark this trip to Clifton Castle as the day that changed my life forever. The events of the next few hours were so confusing that I managed to forget that today, the 6th of December, was also my 15th birthday. When I arrived, there were several Garda vehicles on site and a sleek military jeep that I almost couldn't see except for its tires. The body was covered in a green camouflage that blended perfectly with the field beyond it. The jeep's license plate was a bit spooky, black and gold, bearing just the image of a harp and the number 7. Who the devil gets that sort of license plate with almost no numbers at all? I wondered to myself, as wondering things to myself is 85% of what I do. I should point out that Clifton Castle is actually just the ruins of a castle and has been for at least 90 years. But saying Clifton Castle ruins takes too long, so no one does that. As I jogged through the mush toward the ruins, Pat Finch climbed out of the jeep and rushed up toward me. His version of the Garda uniform was unfamiliar to me. His face made me gasp as it's straight out of a kabuki nightmare. "Are you Boyle?" he shouted. I nodded. "You're just a boy? Brilliant. Follow me," he said with an evil glint in his eye. "Meet the captain and stick these in your nose if you know what's good for you." Finch handed me a pair of regular orange plugs, and I stuck them in my nostrils as I had been instructed. This says a lot about human nature, for if some street cook in Ears Square had told me to shove orange plugs in my nose, I would have told him to get stuffed. But Pat Finch is an imposing figure. We wound our way through the ruins, and Finch clicked on his torch, the Irish word for flashlight, leading me down a moldy spiral of stone steps into the depths of the castle. We descended into a set of caverns that must have served as storage rooms when the castle was still functioning. It was cold down here. It was cold down there, but at least it wasn't raining. Steam was puffing out only of our mouths as our noses were safely and orangely plugged. For no reason at all, I said to Pat Finch, "Perfect place to store cheese, eh?" Because I say stupid things when I'm nervous, and right then an impending sense of dread was filling my stomach. We entered a cavern, and I followed Pat Finch towards some work lights that had been arranged around a strange little crime scene. Several Connemara Garda officers were hustling about, searching with torches, as were officers wearing the same curious uniform as Pat Finch, each carrying a wooden shillelagh, which is kind of like a wooden walking stick, which seemed odd to me at the time. In a moment, I would understand why our noses were plugged. Because leprechauns, especially when they're trapped or in distress, can create awful smells. It's a defense mechanism, much like that of a skunk, to which leprechauns are not at all related. And I was about to meet my first leprechaun. When I saw the little man, I gasped so hard that I popped the earplugs from my nose. My nostrils were instantly flooded with the smell of the worst fish soup in the history of the world. Soup that, if served to them, would make French prisoners riot. I scrambled to replug my nose. Pat Finch hiked his straining belt and said, "He's mushkin. It's how you know the little devil is lying." He gave the leprechaun a firm kick. The leprechaun hissed back at him. As I had never seen a real live leprechaun before, I then did what any sensible person would do and let out a high-pitched scream that sounded like a teenage parrot passing through a wood chipper. I thought I must have been dreaming back in my bed in Galway. I kicked myself in the shin with my heel to check if I was awake, and the pain was both a brief distraction from the chill in my bones and solid confirmation that I was awake. Pat Finch then gave a kick to my other shin. "Ouch!" I screamed. "Just giving you a second opinion," said Pat Finch. "You're not dreaming. Now keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. And if he tries to give you gold, don't take it. Never take gold from one of those devils." I nodded, wincing at the now perfectly balanced pain. The leprechaun in custody was a male, approximately 28 inches tall. At this time, I did not know that leprechauns are more powerful the smaller they are. While I have not met him in person, I have been told by those who have that Ragnall, king of Tir na Nog, is less than 11 inches tall and probably the ugliest thing that has ever lived. This leprechaun was a relatively weak adult male. His name we did not know yet, as it is a rule with fairy folk that you have to guess their names, which is very time-consuming. This leprechaun's face looked like a potato that had somehow had a baby with another potato, and then that baby potato grew to be 1,000 years old and got very constipated. His beet red beard was tinged with ashes, and his eyes were fixed in a permanent squint from the centuries of pipe smoke that had wafted up at them. The commanding officer on the scene was Captain Sayaban de Valera, who is a distant descendant of Ammon de Valera, once the president of Ireland. The captain is a serious, handsome woman with jet black hair that she keeps in a tight bun. She was wearing high boots with leather kneecap protectors, and in her gloved hand she twirled one of the finest fighting shillelaghs I've ever seen. Shillelaghs are mostly for fighting, it turns out. They just pose as walking sticks when they're not being used for fighting. The shillelagh, it was made from oak root, almost purple in color and as hard as a lead pipe. The air made a pleasant whirring sound as she twirled her shillelagh. The captain paced with a scowl on her face that I would later find out was a permanent fixture. "Domnan Hall the Intrepid, Brian the Bold," she whispered at the leprechaun. She was trying to guess his name, as by possessing a leprechaun's name, you can wield tremendous psychological advantage over them. "Don't bother with that. He's been read his Republic rights. Just have him tell Boyle here where the changeling is," grunted Finch. Republic rights are the rights that fairy folk have when they are outside of Tir na Nog and in the human Republic of Ireland. Captain de Valera turned in my direction, and her mismatched eyes shot right through me. Sayaban de Valera has one green eye and one brown eye, which takes a bit of getting used to. Her uniform was different from that of ordinary Garda officers. On her long leather coat was a badge with the Irish word captain on it, and you can probably guess what that means. Across her back was a strap with quick-release gold carabiner hooks, which is how all Tir na Nog Garda carry their fighting shillelaghs. On her belt was a befuddling array of accessories, a small electric torch, a bandolier of clay pipes, just the right size for leprechauns, a standard-issue Garda electric taser, 2 flares, a flask of Jameson whiskey, and then 2 other tiny flasks labeled with Irish words that I didn't know at the time. In truth, what I did not know at the time could fill a book, which is what I am attempting to remedy here in this diary. Like all Irish children, I had heard of the wee folk, leprechauns, farderrigs, harpies, and such, and that they love mischief and they come from Tir na Nog, which is the land of the fairy folk. But like most sensible children, I always assumed this was a But like most sensible children, I always assumed that this was a bunch of made-up blarney, stories invented and embellished in pubs by glassy-eyed old-timers who are pissed as farts on rum and punch. But let me assure you of the fact that I was about to learn on this day, the day that I did not recall was my 15th birthday. Tirnanog is a real place. And the wee folk are not a friendly pack of elves who will fill your shoes with candy while you sleep. They are small, hard-drinking swindlers who would steal your nose and replace it with a turnip if they thought they could make 1 single euro from doing it. They are also more types of wee folk than I had ever imagined. And if you knew how frequently and freely they travel into the human Republic of Ireland, passing right under your bed, you would have trouble sleeping. Some of the fairy folk are delightful, some are disgusting. As for my involvement with the Garda, a special unit of Tirnanog, I will relate to you the events of my education as they unfold, unless the details are of a case still being investigated by the special unit headquarters in Killarney. Captain de Valera paced. On her belt, I could see more oddities, a patch of tobacco and tiny handcuffs with an old Celtic symbol. Leprechauns cannot be held in handcuffs unless you can also distract them with a clever poem that highlights their peril and plays into their inherent narcissism. This detail keeps a lot of qualified candidates out of the Garda of Tirnanog, as instantaneous poem writing while in a crisis situation can be a trick. Captain Sayaban de Valera stepped toward me, sizing me up. She raised her purple shillelagh. I flinched backward until I realized she was doing it to measure me and not to whack me. She checked the distance across my shoulders and then my hips as if she was planning to make me a suit or perhaps a coffin. "Well done, Finch," said the captain. "He's practically a Pole. He'll do nicely if my theory is right." "Ronan Boyle, he was the narrowest Garda in our records," shrugged Pat Finch. "An intern, all the way from Galway." If no one's ever said this about you, let me tell you that it is distressing indeed. The knot in my stomach started to somersault on itself as I imagined being used as some sort of pole here in the depths of the ruins of Clifton Castle, several hundred feet below ground and way out in Connemara, where nobody knows me. Who would even notify Dolores, my guardian, and one of the most beautiful fiddle players you've ever seen? This leprechaun has replaced a human baby with a changeling," Pat Finch belched to me as he gave the leprechaun another swift kick. "And Captain de Valera thinks you may be just the lad for the job. He's stolen the baby from the Republic and replaced it with this," said Captain de Valera as she held up a particularly ugly log. The log was dressed in baby clothes with a terrifying face carved into its upper portion. On a small branch that protruded from where a child's arm might be, there was an evidence tag marking it as Exhibit A. The leprechaun giggled in a fit of glee as the captain held up the log, delighted with his handiwork, sending toots of pipe smoke out of his little snout like a devilish steam engine. His pockets jangled with what was clearly a lot of gold. Captain de Valera twirled her shillelagh pensively. "When I saw this log carved with such meticulous craftsmanship into a changeling for a human baby, I knew it must be the work of one of the greatest leprechaun carvers of Tirnanog," she said as she paced the cavern. The steam from her nostrils made me aware for the first time that she was not wearing nose plugs. She was used to the foul smell of leprechauns when they were musking. "There's no way this changeling was carved by any other than Tagda of the Floating Lakes," the captain pronounced, and she tossed the log to a junior Garter officer on the perimeter of the crime scene. "Pack it up and label it Changeling Log, carved by Tagda, greatest of the leprechaun tricksters. Not this amateur we've captured here. Why, this wee fellow here would probably make a changeling out of Pete. Pack it up, lads. We're done." There was a strange glow in the cavern. I turned to see that the leprechaun's face was now steaming red, with vapor rising from it as he twitched like a steel tea kettle left in a microwave by someone who has never read the instructions for a microwave. Captain de Valera turned and gave me the smallest smile you can imagine. A moment later, the leprechaun bolted up, spilling gold coins everywhere as he howled, "Tagged of the floating lakes never carved a changeling log that well in his wildest dreams. 'Twas carved by me own self, I, Lally, killer of unicorns." And with that, Captain de Valera spun, knocking the leprechaun's hat off with her shillelagh. She extended her hand to meet his tiny one. "Ah, Rory, killer of unicorns? Pleased to make your acquaintance," she whispered in his ear with a devilish smile. The leprechaun, now name known and registered as Rory, killer of unicorns, fumed. He'd just been tricked into telling us his name and had his hat knocked off, which turned out to be a major insult to fairy folk. A Garda officer with a camera popped in and snapped off a few pictures of Rory, front and profile. Another officer measured his height and his beard with a bronze staff, and a third knelt down and did a charcoal rubbing of the underside of his little shoe. This was before I knew that leprechaun shoes are the best made things in either our world or Tir na Nog. Leprechauns will spend centuries perfecting their shoes. The buckles are made from solid gold. According to tradition, leprechaun kings and queens never danced, even at a wedding or seli, or party. Some thought this was because it was undignified for fairy royals, but the reality is that their shoes are simply far too heavy, with gold and jewel-encrusted buckles that outweigh their entire body. As for the charcoal rubbing the officer was making, this is standard policy when registering a new leprechaun in the files of the Garda of Tir na Nog, as the soles of leprechaun shoes are as distinct as snowflakes, no two being alike. Rory, killer of unicorns, fumed and kicked. He then did something that leprechauns only do when they are very angry. He snapped his pipe in half. A few of the Garda officers gasped at the sight of it. "File that shoe print in Killarney, and while you're at it, run a check to see if any unicorns are missing in Tir na Nog," said Pat Finch to the officer with the charcoal sketch, as Rory fidgeted, alternately fuming with rage and then weeping over his broken pipe. I didn't know it then, but the likelihood that this Rory was actually a killer of unicorns was precisely 0. The average unicorn stands 15 hands high, which is about 4 inches. 15 hands high from its hooves to its withers, and the horn on its head is not for show. Yes, unicorn horns can make dirty water clean, but the horn's real purpose is as a weapon, very specifically for killing leprechauns. The horns, or dowsers as the unicorns call them, are as hard and sharp as diamonds and could poke through an armored tank as if it were a soggy cheese sandwich that you had forgotten about after a long, wonderful day trip to the beach. Leprechauns love boastful names like Rory, killer of unicorns. The more pretentious the name, the better. Later on, I would meet and befriend Owen, handsomest fellow in the sugar marshes ever, and Aline, whose luscious eyes sparkle like 10,000 emeralds in the sun. He wasn't, and they don't. Yet both of these are totally normal leprechaun names. It would be as if your name was Shayla, who is better than Adel at singing. Leprechauns are confused by the mundanity of our human names and see them as a sign of our low self-esteem. Captain de Valera let her fingers casually flick at one of the clay pipes on her belt. Rory's eyes seized upon it like a starving man as they began to well up with tears. "Care for a new pipe, would you?" she asked him, knowing full well the answer was 1,000,000 times yes. "Aye, miss. Let Rory, killer of unicorns, have one of yours. You've so many to spare," he pleaded in his leprechaun accent, which sounds a lot like a human from Dingle who's had a strong dose of helium. "Tell nice Mr. Boyle from Galway here where the human baby is, and we'll see about that pipe," said the captain. Rory's eyes darted back and forth. He was clearly torn about revealing the location of the baby, but the notion of a new clay pipe was just too much to resist. "The parents of that ugly, stupid baby caught me at the end of the faintest rainbow you ever saw in your entire life.
I told them I would give them no gold, but that if they let me go, I would talk to the horses at Ballinrobe Raceway and find out which one was going to win the Derby the next day, making them as rich as 20 sultans. Captain de Valera smacked the back of my head with her shillelagh. Why aren't you writing this down, Boyle? I fumbled to extract my notebook from my trousers and began to copy down the Leprechaun's story. This was technically my first official act in the Garda Special Unit of Tirnanog, the division of the Irish National Police that oversees crimes of the fairy folk. I was as good as my word, said Rory. The fools set me free, and I made haste to the racetrack in Ballinrobe, stopping only for a wee bit of the juice of the barley with my mate Mike, who is a troll under a bridge on the Robe River. Which bridge? Said Sayaban de Valera. The stone with the fork at the Craig Road, whimpered Rory, his eyes locked on the pipe, which Sabana was now casually spinning in her fingers. Go and ask Mike. He'll tell you for sure that I was on my way to Ballinrobe and I did as I said. Pat Finch nodded to a Garda officer. Send a car around to Craig Road and see if this Mike the Troll will back up the little man's story here, he said. The officer nodded and departed. So Mike the Troll and I made merry under his bridge, and then he decided to join me, and we made off to the racetrack, said Rory. When we arrived at the paddock at Ballinrobe, the horses were still awake, nervous about the race the next afternoon. Mike and I thought that the least we could do was be sociable, share some of our strong whiskey with these poor dim-witted horses. Which we did, and I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that the whiskey was crack flowed until a wee hour. At this point, my hand was practically frozen stiff as I wrote down the Leprechaun's story. I dropped my pen, which skittered across the stone floor. I blew on my fingers to warm them up, but even my breath was cold down there in the caverns, so that didn't do much good. Captain de Valera shot me an annoyed look, although it may have just been a regular look, and her mismatched eyes and perma scowl made it seem like I was a target for her shillelagh again. Sorry, I blurted. Just trying to keep up, I said, collecting my pen from the ground. Pat Finch snorted and tugged at his belt, which seemed to be an endless escape mission from his tummy toward the ground. The captain took a small pouch of tobacco off of her belt and began to methodically pack the clay pipe. Rory's lips trembled as he reached for the pipe, and she gently pressed back against his hands with her shillelagh. Get to the point, said Captain de Valera. Where is the baby? Mike and I got a wee bit drunk with the horses, who gave us the inside scoop that the one among them called Hold Me Closer, Tiny Dancer would be the winning horse at the Derby, said Rory the Leprechaun. We thanked the horses and left. If Mike ate one of the smaller horses named Bingo was his name, oh, well, I can't recall if that happened at all, and I'm not even sure why I should mention it. Shall I ring the racetrack and see if a horse has been eaten? I asked in an unplanned effort to seem useful. Indeed, Mr. Boyle, said Captain de Valera, and radio the lads on their way to question Mike the Troll and tell him to check the bridge for horse bones. Eating a draught horse is a 50-euro fine, but eating a racehorse could mean a year in the joy vaults, and said the captain pointedly to Rory as she poked his chest with the tip of her shillelagh. The Joy Vaults is a slang term for the subterranean cells beneath the Mountjoy prison in Dublin, sometimes called the Joy. The above-ground levels of Mountjoy prison hold Ireland's medium-security human prisoners. It's a place with which I am familiar, as I've spent the third Tuesday of each month there in the badly lit visitors' ward. After the scandal, my parents, Brendan and Fiona Boyle, became inmates number 477738 and 477739. More on that in a moment. The Joy Vaults are the 9 subterranean levels of the prison, lake and stables that are reserved for the fairy folk, sherries and banshees, leprechauns, unicorns, etc., who violate the laws of the Republic of Ireland. The first 3 levels down are minimum security, and the bottom 6 are reserved for more serious offenders. After years in the Garda, I have still only seen the first 4 levels. The 9th level, I'm told, is strictly for banshees, whose appearance always harbingers the death of a human. As a result, the lower level of the Joy Vaults are not guarded by human officers, but by deputized leprechauns. I returned Mike under his bridge and made it back to the parents of that ugly, unkind baby, said Rory. I told them about Hold Me Closer, Tiny Dancer, and they went to Ballinrobe that day, and they bet their life savings on the mare. And she lost, I shouted out like a person who has watched a lot of Sherlock Holmes on the telly, which I am, because she was so drunk on your leprechaun whiskey. No, you idiot, replied Rory. She won. All of the horses were drunk, and one of them may or may not have been eaten by Mike the Troll. The parents of that hideous, sarcastic baby were exactly as I had promised, as rich as 20 sultans. I thought it was only fair that I get a wee finder's fee for all me troubles. They disagreed and set about to kill me with a hurley stick. I lay in wait in a nearby well, and by cover of night, I returned and swapped their baby for this magnificently carved log. 100% within my rights. Look it up. The air hung heavy for a moment. Captain de Valera shot Pat Finch a look. He's not wrong, she said. Write up the baby's parents for second-degree tinkering with fairy folk, and Rory here will get a €100 fine for making a changeling. Aye, ma'am, said Pat Finch. Now, is the baby hidden where I suspect it is? Asked the captain of the wee man. Aye, down the Oblet, whimpered Rory, and with that the captain handed him the new clay pipe loaded with fresh tobacco. Rory struck a match on his nose and lit the pipe, sucking in the huge plume of smoke as if he'd been underwater and the tobacco was fresh air. He giggled with glee as Captain de Valera turned to me, her permanent scowl remaining precisely as it always looked. The Oblet. This is what I feared. And that's where you come in, Ronan Boyle, she said. I will do my best, ma'am, I replied, my voice sounding weaker than I had expected. Perhaps because I now had the nose plugs in for so long, combined with the frigid cavern air and approximately 3 hours of sleep. You're just the lad, said the captain as her eyes fixed on a narrow hole in the wall of the cavern. Do you know what an Oblet is? No, ma'am, I replied, and it was true. At this point, I had no idea what one was, but was only moments away from never forgetting. Oblet is from the French for to forget, she said, as 2 Garda officers started to forcefully attach mountain climbing straps to my midsection. In some old castles, it was a shaft where they would dump the bodies of their enemies. The bottom was sometimes lined with spikes, and down there their foes would be quite literally forgotten, said the captain. Like a fast-acting dungeon, chuckled Pat Finch, the veins in his face pulsing like a jack-o'-lantern whose candle was about to flicker out from a strong cross breeze. The 2 Garda officers attached a clamp to the harness on my back and began unfurling 100 feet of nylon rope, which they secured around my midsection. This Oblet was sealed up, said the captain. Without a wrecking ball, the opening will only fit the narrowest possible fellow. I understood now that I had been called into this case simply because I, Ronan Boyle, was the narrowest possible fellow, the only one who would fit into the hole. Now it was my job to be lowered into the Oblet and collect the human baby that Rory, killer of unicorns, had stashed down there. I pulled out my nose plugs to get a few deep breaths. The musking fish soup smell had changed. It was now a tobacco and fish soup smell, which was somehow even more atrocious. I stepped toward the hole. Making myself as narrow as I could, I pulled myself into it. A profound darkness wrapped me up like a blanket. Captain de Valera passed her torch in after me. I fumbled for it and clicked it on. The officers on the other end of the rope started to lower me down. And that's the end of Chapter 1 of Ronan Boyle and the Bridge of Riddles. I've been reading this book recently, actually, and I'm really enjoying it. And I thought you guys would like it as well. And I hope maybe you guys give it a check out. It's Ronan Boyle and the Bridge of Riddles by Thomas Lennon. Here's the cover. I hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.